Hello everybody, my researchable question for the literature review was, how does being a collegiate student athlete impact a student socially and emotionally?
When I dove into the research, I found a lot of great information about student athletes in general. I found out that there are many factors that play a role when being a student athlete and when linking it to the social and emotional lives of those athletes. Throughout this, you will hear me bring up gender and race a lot. Also, just to note something, I think that it's important that you know that much of what I found and what I will be discussing throughout this video is mainly focusing on Division I athletes. For those of you who aren't really into college sports, Division I is the highest level of intercollegiate athletics sanctioned by the National Collegiate Athletic Association in the United States, which is also known as the NCAA. To put that into perspective, Bloomsburg University is Division II in football, where a school like Penn State is Division I in football. So I think that's basically enough background information. So now I'm going to move into what I found eye-opening and interesting throughout my research. A lot of the research that I found that revolved around race talked about how Black student athletes at predominantly white institutions felt stigmatized by their peers, professors, and administrators. They described it as these Black student athletes basically being admitted into the universities just based on their athletic abilities and not their academic abilities. They oftentimes felt like they were underprepared. And this isn't just Black athletes, but I would say 9 out of the 10 articles that I read was focusing very much on those Black athletes. One of the qualitative pieces that I read, a Black student athlete said that he felt like a used good, and then he went into further depth and said that at his university he felt like he gave so much to the university and they gained so much money based on his athletic abilities, but when he left the institution and didn't go on to play professionally, he wasn't ready for the real world. He felt underprepared, just like he felt like when he entered the university, but he also didn't know how to go about in the real world because he was stigmatized already, and then also socially the only people he really talked to, and you see this time and time again throughout the research that I looked through, that student athletes tend to gravitate towards other student athletes. So when this young man went into the real world, he didn't really know how to navigate relationships that weren't revolving around sports. So when he left the institution, he didn't have sports anymore, so he was kind of forced to start new relationships, and he didn't know how to go about that, and he felt a lot of resentment towards his university because he felt like he was only there for athletics, and everybody that was on that campus made him feel that way. And then what was very eye-opening is I'm going through all this research and finding the same thing over and over again, just in different words. And then I come upon this article done by Cooper, Davis, and Dougherty in 2017. And they did this study, and they found that non-Black male student athletes on average reported more positive feelings about their social experiences than Black male student athletes. And that just kind of shows the influence that race has on the male student athlete's experience in that sport or any sport. They found that there's a positive correlation between co-curricular involvement and expected engagement in educationally purposeful activities. And these, those activities included doing research with faculty and practicums and internships. That's something that Black student athletes wanted, and there was a lot of research before done on this, but it never really included Black student athletes. It was just student athletes in general. So I found it very eye-opening that they did find something that kind of went against not so much against, but pointed out something that wasn't pointed out in previous research that had been done on this same topic. Another area that I want to talk about is the idea of mental health under and how that falls under the emotional life of these athletes, and also talk about athlete burnout. So student athletes, there are already risk factors when it comes to mental health, extended time being away from family because they're out there traveling. For instance, like winter sports, their winter break is literally like Christmas till January 1st, and then they have to be back on campus, especially these D1 institutions. So, they're away from their families for long periods of time, and then they're also dealing with the possibility of having an injury and having to deal with the emotional consequences of that injury. There is an increased risk of alcohol and substance abuse among student athletes. And then something that we probably don't think about a lot, or might not even pass through our mind at all when we think of student athletes, is the media attention, or the attention from a large population. When you are playing at a Division I school, you have an added pressure that you're just think about being your average student, but then you have all this media attention. Say you're the starting quarterback for Penn State. Social media plays a big role into that, and that's another added risk factor when it comes to the mental health of these student athletes and how being a student athlete impacts them emotionally. So then, we have these added risk factors when it comes to mental health in student athletes, and then these athletes are, when they do want to come forward about having mental health issues, they're not well supported. For the most part, what I was finding was that the sports culture celebrates mental toughness, and if you're a male athlete specifically, obviously some sports this applies to both genders, but a lot of times even in society, if you're having mental health issues, you are seen as weak. So obviously there's that stigma in the general population, and that same stigma is there with student athletes. And so what happens is we have more and more student athletes who are not coming forward about these mental health issues, and it's affecting them emotionally and socially, and they're not coming forward because they see it's perceived that the disadvantages of coming forward outweigh the benefits of coming forward. So some of those disadvantages is less playing time, as I said before, being perceived as mentally weak or lacking commitment to the sport. Say you're having mental health issues and you have to go speak to a therapist, and your therapist says that you need to cut back, then it's perceived as you're not mentally tough and you're not committed to our sport, and that you are weak. And so this is happening, and we have more and more student athletes who are unable to balance their social, emotional, and academic lives. So it's kind of like they have to pick one. And a lot of times when it comes down to, you're on a scholarship for athletics at a Division I school, it comes down to you choosing your athletics over your emotional well-being
and your social well-being.
When I was doing this research, I found that 1/3 of student athletes are struggling to find energy due to the physical demands of their sport, and 1/4 of student athletes reported being exhausted from the mental demands of their sport. So when we have athletes who are burned out,
this is where we see athletes struggling in other areas of their life. And of course, this is only some of the research that really stuck out to me. There is a whole bunch of research out there, and as you can see in this video, there's just piles and piles of research. So if you have any other questions or are interested in learning more about how being a student athlete affects a student socially and emotionally, just ask.